Welcome to USA Global TV and Radio, where our mission is to provide education, entertainment, hope, and inspiration. USA Global TV and Radio connects you with experts and audiences all around the world every single day to help you succeed in business and to live a richer life. Visit us at usaglobaltv.com to learn about career and life-changing training and mentoring programs like the Listening Mentor. Subscribe to our newsletter to stay informed about our special programs and offers. Discover how you can become a guest on one of our shows or a host or producer of a USA Global TV and Radio show of your very own. That's USA Global TV and Radio, where the doctor is always in.
Hello and welcome to USA Global TV and Radio. I am TRACY Perkins, and our show today is Dementia Home Care. I invite you to subscribe to our YouTube channel, USA Global TV and Radio. I am the author of Dementia Home Care, How to Prepare Before, During, and After. And joining me today is our special guest, Kitty Isley. She is an NPR alum and the host and producer of 24/7, a podcast about caregiving, after caring for her father with dementia. Welcome, Kitty.
Thank you. Nice to see you.
It's nice to finally meet you.
Looks like we might have had a little freeze there, but I'm here and I'll just keep listening.
Okay, am I back?
You're back. Visual.
Oh,
yep.
Sorry about that.
It's okay.
Most of my guests most of my audience probably doesn't know about your journey. So do you mind telling them how you got started on your caregiving journey?
Sure. I am a longtime NPR producer, writer, editor, and I found 10 years ago, actually a decade ago, I was working on our show Morning Edition in the evenings. And both my parents had very bad falls. They both ended up in the ICU. My dad had a brain bleed. My mother was in a hospital for several days with a broken hip. And between the two of them, they needed demanding care and care after hospital discharge. Because I was working evenings between my sister and myself in this area in suburban Washington, it sort of became a default for me to manage the ongoing after effects and their needs after this big kind of catastrophic incident for both of them. So it very quickly became evident that I had two parents in their 70s who I didn't think of as that old, but that on a dime, your life can change and you are required as a family member to step in and step up and make sure that two people who can't entirely care for themselves are cared for. So that kind of kicked everything off. And my mom passed in 2016, and my father's health really declined. I'll just say for listeners or viewers who are taking care or experiencing dementia in a family member, my dad's big condition was heart failure from a childhood condition, but it caused vascular dementia. It caused loss of oxygen to the brain. So, as you watch things kind of moderately not add up, you notice strange things happening, unexplained problems, accidents, difficulties. You don't necessarily go, oh, somebody's got dementia. But as those accidents or difficulties or complications start to get more dramatic and start to add up, it's clear that for some adults as they age, cognitive issues are going to become a much bigger challenge. And in our family, there were both physical issues that meant inability to do all what are called the activities of daily living, to take care of oneself, drive, cook, operate machines like microwaves or can openers, or take care of financial duties in a prompt way. All of which means at a point after a very serious hospitalization for my dad and some time in an assisted living place, his condition didn't look too good, and it just made more sense for me to come back to this house. I'm in a childhood house because it only looked like he had maybe 6 months left. And my sister and I talked about this and thought, what's going to make him happiest and safest and provide a kind of quiet end that makes him feel comfortable. To our surprise, he actually stabilized and he lived another 3 years, during which we all hit COVID and his condition declined, but he was manageable. So it meant that I was now providing care kind of around the clock, and eventually hired someone, but still was in charge of all the evening care and weekend care. And that became my primary obligation for the last 3 years. Tracy, can you hear me?
I'm sorry, I
There
just
you
came back on. I apologize. I seem to have issues with my line here, but I can totally relate to what you were feeling, having those 3 years where you were the primary caregiver, and yes, you had some help and you had your sister. And I believe in some of your podcasts that we are about to talk about here in a few minutes, you even,
Still
am I
here.
back?
You're back, yeah.
Okay, that you even had an issue where you talked to your cousins and had them help you locate your dad after he escaped. What was that like?
Well, escape maybe is a little heavy word, but let's just say did an ill-advised road trip.
Okay.
My dad decided on a spur of the moment that he wanted to go to a friend's funeral in the Midwest. He was originally from Minnesota, spent a lot of time there for political reasons. So it was very comfortable for him to be going out to Minnesota and the Midwest, but not with dementia and not just 7 weeks after he'd been hospitalized for a month. Excuse me. He made these plans to spend Thanksgiving with my cousins without telling me or my sister, and then just announced he was going to be flying to the Midwest, go to a funeral on Wednesday, and fly on to my cousin's house. And I wasn't even sure that my cousin had gotten the phone call, had gotten the message. So it was a very weird decision, and we couldn't really stop him. He was already heading to the airport, where he lost his phone. He left it in the, when you go through the check, the whatever it's called, the weapons check, the metal detector, the phone disappeared. He was picked up by friends to go to a funeral and then dropped off at a hotel, and then decided he would drive to Iowa from Minnesota, also without telling us. And my cousin started calling me on Thanksgiving Day saying, "We haven't heard from your dad. He's been on the road for 5 hours. He should have been here 2 hours ago. What's going on?" And so he ended up on Thanksgiving Day for 12 hours on a highway, confused. And he would stop at small gas stations and ask to use the phone and call my cousin to say, "I think I'm in this area, but I'm almost at your house. I'll be there in an hour." And she couldn't really track where he was calling from. In one case, the gas station owners, after my dad left, redialed the number and got my cousin and said, "We're worried about this gentleman." But because we didn't know where he rented the car from, we couldn't ask the police to try to trace him. It's snowing. It's a holiday. He's on a highway, no phone, and very confused mind. He finally ends up parking himself at a Target on Black Friday night, and my cousin figures out, he gets Target to call my cousin, and they come retrieve him from an hour away. And that was just a wake-up call. That was terrifying. It was frustrating. And to him, he didn't really understand what had gone wrong. And part of what had gone wrong is he'd also accidentally canceled his flight home. So on Thanksgiving weekend, I'm trying to get him, an overnight flight back to DC through O'Hare for $1,000 because I'm booking it in one day, and get wheelchair assistance and all those kinds of things. I mean, those aren't so interesting to your listeners, but when someone has an accident while they're traveling or when they're not home, it's often like bending yourself into a pretzel, contorting yourself to make sure that they get back safely. And travel became an issue because he wasn't supposed to be doing it, and sometimes he would just take off. And that was sort of our big wake-up call. This just can't continue. And we have my cousin on trying to tell her side of what it was like in the first episode of my podcast series, 24/7. And I called her back after to say, tell me what your side was. Tell me what was going on. And it's funny. In some ways, it's very funny now, especially his arrival at Target, where she found him almost at midnight driving around on one of those Target scooters,
Oh, no.
entertaining himself. Like, my dad was a wonderful person, and it almost makes me feel guilty conveying some of the things that happened in his very late life, because they don't negate a very full and accomplished life. But there's still something I feel like people need to know. These things can happen to all of us, and maybe make that more visible, because I felt so alone trying to deal with this. I just didn't know how many other people are taking care of an elder. And it's 50 million of us unpaid right now in the US. So I felt like, how come I don't know that? Why don't I hear from them? And much of this stuff happens at home or in hospitals or, residential settings. So you don't see this in the same way you might see people with a child who's misbehaving or having to strap a kid into a car seat. Children are much more in our public spaces and imagination. The elderly, not so much. So you may not be aware that lots of people are going through this.
It is, like you said, it's very isolating.
Yeah.
I myself had the same experience where I didn't know other people were going through it or how to deal with it. And I started talking to my neighbors, and they were going through the same thing. And it's an interesting thing. I had 7 families in my neighborhood that were all doing dementia care at the same time, and none of us knew.
Are you
and it
kidding?
wasn't until I brought it up that we all started talking about we were taking care of our moms, we were taking care of our dads, sisters, whatever it was, we were taking care of somebody. It was revealing that and then we weren't supporting each other because we didn't know at that point. So I can completely understand.
Go ahead. I'm nodding in agreement very much, and impressed that you found these folks and recognize our need to support each other.
Well, I am one of those people that community build, and so I started our neighborhood watch, and I did a few things like that because I didn't want, if we bought the family home, and my aunt lived here by herself for a number of years, and I did not want her to, what happened to her happened to the rest of the neighborhood, where we had a major snowstorm. The power was out for a week. She had no place to go. We couldn't get to her, but our neighbors across the street, God bless them, they took her in and they kept her warm. And then she would go home and make sure that nothing happened to the house. And then she'd come back and stay with them. And she was in her early 80s when that happened. So I didn't want anything happen like that again.
Very wise of you to see that, and God bless the neighbors.
Yeah, I'm very lucky. Having that kind of a neighborhood. But this leads me to the point of past.
Can you repeat that?
This leads me into what made you do your podcast? How did you choose to do that?
I was working a lot of projects for various public radio enterprises, a lot with NPR that were project-based, not go in and run morning edition at night. And one of the clients was Texas Public Radio. You'll see the little logo on the upper right side. And I mentioned to them, I started keeping a little bit of a diary on my phone because I couldn't think of this as something that I wanted to share publicly in a day-to-day way. I felt like I needed to have some control and not expose my dad really quite as nakedly as maybe some people are doing with YouTube or with rather TikTok. And so I just thought I'd better take some notes. And I actually was writing quite a bit, but I thought, if I don't do something on this with a radio background, that's crazy. So why don't I tape a little bit of what I go through and focus it on the caregiver so I don't expose my dad as a problem. I mean, the whole situation is really difficult, but I didn't want to make him, I really felt like I didn't want to have somebody I love and care about deeply be exposed at his worst moments. So I was pretty cautious about the taping I did, and literally on right now, my iPhone, just recording it, and decided I'll focus it on the caregiving, not on the person whose dementia is affecting their life. And I mentioned it to Texas Public Radio and said, I'm just kind of knocking around with some of these ideas. And I'm so desperate. I'm literally calling people I know saying, how did you do this? Can I interview you? Because I am so at sea. I don't know how to handle the decline in friendships. His social life was very limited before COVID even, because he couldn't get downtown and see people that he normally would have seen. So I became like a social director almost. I had to help him continue his friendships. People wanted to stay in touch, but they didn't know he was at home. How do I handle his increasing medical needs? I didn't understand whether I should talk to him about dying. Like, I don't know. We've had so many emergencies. Do I need to have him help understand what he's thinking? In one case, I found a very difficult time in the hospital trying to give him a shave. He was there for 3 weeks, almost 4. My sister and I felt like, he just doesn't look or feel like himself. He probably wants a shave and get his hair washed. But for a lot of reasons, that wasn't possible. We tried to do it for him, and it was just a mess. And I later found out there's actually a razor that's designed for families to more easily shave a loved one, especially if you've never done it. Trying to reach across and give someone a shave is really awkward. I interviewed the engineer behind that razor. Like, that's so logical, but I wouldn't have known about it or thought of it because it's not in my wheelhouse to go, oh, I might have to give someone a shave. I never thought of that. So in taping some of these, not knowing what I'd use it for, I had a batch of basically small interviews with people trying to answer my own questions. And when I mentioned that to Texas, they said, let's take a shot at this. Let's just try something fairly easy and use your diaries. We were very fortunate in getting funding from the also University of Texas, San Antonio, Biggs Institute for Alzheimer's and Neuro, I'm not sure how to say it correctly, but credit UT San Antonio, Biggs Institute that does dementia research. They gave us some funding for a few seasons. And at the end of our first season, me sort of delivering the podcast to launch the first 5 episodes, my father died. Not an awful death, and actually quite beautiful one. And I feel very comforted about how it went. But it also meant we had a different setup to do another few seasons. And that became more of me interviewing other people about elements of dementia, of caregiving, and how I could understand it in an artistic sense. Had people written or made movies about or thought deeply about what it means to care for people as they age? I wasn't seeing any models in my reading, my TV shows, whatever. It was like this was an absent experience. And again, 50 million of us are doing it. So the podcast kind of morphed a little from diaries to real people and their experiences, and some experts explaining to me the nature of dementia, which I hadn't really considered that it had so many physical attributes and complications. So the second and third season, which are 5 and 6 episodes, are sort of me informing myself more, and I hope listeners as well, both the intimate experience of caregiving and specific slices of what happens when you have to take care of someone, whether it's the financial landscape that we don't have created very well for long-term care, or the physical manifestation of dementia in balance problems, in vision problems. Smell and taste can also be affected. And I noticed these things with my dad, but I didn't know why they were happening. Does that answer your question?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, because I was always curious about how you started your audio diary, because I've listened to every single one of your podcasts, first of all. I absolutely enjoyed every single one of them. And after you did this, when your father passed and you started changing the perspective, that was, hold on. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay. All right. That was very life-changing for me. It was interesting hearing from Cynthia Hewling-Hummel to
any number of the guests. You may not have their name.
I'm sorry, did you hear me?
No, it was interesting to hear from a woman you named Cynthia Hewling-Hummel, who is a minister who has an Alzheimer's diagnosis, is living with Alzheimer's, but is still pretty cogent, but has stepped down from her work as a minister because she can no longer do her job in a sort of full-time way. But she's now using her talents as an advocate and a speaker. And as she says, it's kind of it's her service to God in a different way. And that's a very powerful person to interview, to understand what it's like from the interior, from someone who's losing their faculties, aware of it, trying to get out ahead of it, and very conscious of what kinds of help they'll need. I found her very moving and very inspiring. She's one of the people in our second season. We also talked to an occupational therapist, Dr. Teepa Snow, which name people may know. to understand better how dementia operates in the body, and some of the tips that she has put into practice that I think were kind of intuitive for me, but may not be until you've been around people for longer who are experiencing dementia. There's a young woman, Jacqueline, and I've just spaced on her last name, and I'm sorry, but she has done a TikTok series and an Instagram series called Mom of My Mom. And she gave up an acting career in New York to move back to Los Angeles and care for her mother with very advanced Alzheimer's. And she's young. She's not in her mid-30s. And that represents about a quarter of the people doing this care are what we call millennials. And many, a full quarter of that 50 million are people who suddenly have much more demands on them as caregivers than most of them expected. That's usually an era, that's when you're having kids, not when you're taking care of parents. So she did a fabulous job of kind of revealing some of her struggles and some of her techniques for helping her mom in the house, which I thought they were both funny and poignant. And one thing I found in making this podcast is this is painful stuff. But if you want to reach people and have them continue to listen and make their suggestions, it has to have some fun to it, or it has to have a reason to lean in. It can't just be the hard stuff. There were extremely funny moments, and I had to balance not making fun of anyone, but also identifying that some of this stuff is just hysterical. Excuse me.
I have to say, it was very moving listening to her. And also when you were interviewing, and I'm going to go blank on her name.
It's just, I'm calling it senior moments in my head, or post-COVID.
Lauren Miller Rogan. Okay. And her dad, about her journey and why she started Hilarity for charity, because I found that very inspiring, because a lot of young people are shielded from this and they never know anything about it.
I will credit her to the skies. Lauren Miller Rogan is a youngish, I think she might just be 40, an actor, a director, a writer in Hollywood. And her mom had early onset Alzheimer's from probably Lauren's late teen years. She noticed it particularly at her graduation from college. Lauren happens to be married to Seth Rogen, the actor and comedian. And as she was living in California and her parents were in Florida, it was increasingly difficult to help her father care for her mom, and making her quite, was depressed. And I experienced that too. So I understand, and I think it's fair to call it that. She talked about it. And at one point, I think Seth and another friend said, why don't we just throw a fundraiser with a comedy night and we'll make some money for Alzheimer's research? And they realized they made some money. They got comedians together and thought, it's not the research that we can make a dent in, but it is helping caregivers, because this is a 24/7 job. And many people don't have any backup, don't have adequate funds to do this, are just so lost and so unhelped. That's not the word I would use, but as they proceeded with this, they came up with a name and created a nonprofit called Hilarity for Charity. And one of the neat things that Lauren has done with this charity, with this nonprofit, is to provide ongoing caregiver workshops and support groups. And because COVID sort of taught us that we can all do things on Zoom, she's providing, led by counselors, almost open-ended drop-in or subscribe to caregiving conversations just simply for support, not even instructional. They're provided in Spanish as well as English for different, you might be in a different position. You might be caring for a spouse, a parent, a sibling. You might be grieving someone. And she's created this amazing set of caregiver support groups and workshops. So Hilarity for Charity, if anyone listening or watching is looking for some help, I commend them enormously for doing this. And as they say, you have to be able to laugh or you won't get through this. There are other people in this season of my podcast that are using improv techniques that they learned as comedians to deal with an elder who has dementia. How can they respond to that person's need without correcting it or denying it or making it seem kind of crazy? They just lean into the experience and try to guide the behavior. I found that just really moving and really clever and creative. I think as a society, we can be a lot more creative about how we provide care and how we care for caregivers, because this is only going to grow.
Sorry about that. I dropped off again. I love the fact that you just talked about the using improv. There is something about improv that makes it so that it is not imposing yourself, and it makes it so much easier to redirect somebody. And when I heard that, I was very, very moved by it. And did you ever do anything like that? You said you were intuitive in some of your caregiving, but did you ever use something like that when you were taking care of your dad?
I hadn't learned about it. I hadn't learned this idea from this one comic in Chicago who now trains people and uses this as sort of a small technique for smaller caregiving groups. I think I read a lot about how to respond to people. Honestly, I was reading more about like kind of end of life care, because so many emergencies seemed like we were almost at that moment. And I wanted to know how to talk to my dad about it, or how to listen to him, I guess is a better way, and how to provide whatever care he was going to need. So in a funny way, I think many people, at least for me, and I've heard this validated really, you're in this sort of period of grieving the person that you knew as they are disappearing. And a lot of my thinking and reading was to support myself a bit in that, because I was just honestly so depressed. One of the things I tried to do was not show that, not bring that to my interactions with him, because I didn't want him to feel like a burden. So maybe my response to your question is less how did I lean into the improv or the nature of his needs, and more about how I tried to kind of bring myself to this experience without making it difficult or a chore. And when I chose to do it, I thought he had 6 months left. And I thought, all right, this is 6 months where I can do one thing. I can help my dad at the end of his life. There won't be another chance to do that. And that's more important to me right now than finding a new job and doing a full push on a career moment. And I thought, I have the savings, I can do this, but I can't help him later. This is the only time this is going to happen. And it felt more important to me and more significant to say, all right, that's what I'm going to focus on. And I'll take some temp jobs and projects, but really my focus is this moment as he's passing, leaving this earth. And then he kept going happily in a lot of ways. He did have, I will say this, and you know, for anyone dealing with this, sometimes the hardships are so real, mood changes are real. Sometimes people with dementia and Alzheimer's can become very aggressive or hostile or whatever manifestation of the disease happens. That didn't happen for my dad, and he just had such an optimistic temperament in general, and I was really grateful for that. So I tried to rise up to that and sort of meet him with equal positiveness. In a lot of ways, he gave me that as a model. I don't think even intentionally, but I had to think, you know, if this guy is meeting his hardships with a positive attitude, with a smile, with an effort to keep doing things, then that's my model for how I have to come into this. I will say that I talked to Patty Davis, the daughter of Ronald Reagan, former President Ronald Reagan, and she talked about her transformation as she was his caregiver, or gave care, not full time, and how it really does change you. And you have the choice to show up in this role in a way that can really provide deep spiritual transformation. And it's sort of, to me, it was the most human thing I will ever do. And I thought, I've got to let this experience sit with all the grief it brings, because you really are often in an emergency situation and in a chaotic situation where you don't know what to do, and you're losing the person that you knew. How do I really talk to myself and show up in the best way for that person, but without, you know, becoming kind of a martyr? Because this takes so much out of you. You have to get a way to give yourself breaks, treats, reality checks.
Oh, I just want to give you a hug right now.
Oh, God, thank you. I want to hug everybody. I mean, so many people go through this, and I had an easier time. We had some funds. We could hire a caregiver. We were very fortunate in the person we hired had cared for one of my dad's friends who had Parkinson's and had recently died. So there was a little bit of a knowledge of our situation and who she was, and her loyalty was extraordinary. And my dad simply wanted to basically be at home in his easy chair, watching his ball games, looking out the window at his azaleas, enjoying a beer. Many of those things were no longer possible. But he could at least be in a situation, a home he'd been in for 50 years. And that, I'm grateful we were able to do that almost until the end. But lots of folks are doing it without anybody assisting them, or doing it while they have to be at an office job or somewhere all day, maybe working in a school or a hospital, and leaving someone at home, and then having to kind of take on this second shift to care for them at night. Many people with cognitive issues are not sleeping well, or in my case, my dad would often get up and think, oh, time for ice cream. I'm going to walk to the kitchen and get myself some ice cream, and he'd fall. And I would have to figure out, how do we get him back in bed? The neighbors came over in the middle of the night one time. I was calling 311 a lot, which I didn't know. You can call the 311 number, and usually an EMS team will come and help you right the person who's fallen and make sure they haven't had an injury. That is a tiring thing when you have somebody who gets up multiple times a night and you can hear banging around the house, and then bam, somebody goes down, and you have to figure out how to get a body larger than yours back on their feet. And frequently that's not very easy for them or for you. That was an example of kind of the physicality of caregiving. And for people who do this, it can be very dangerous. A lot of actually paid caregivers find themselves getting injured because, most adults you try taking care of 180 pounds that doesn't have muscle coordination, and you very quickly see that this is not something that one person can do alone.
So what kind of advocacy are you doing now, or are you doing any advocacy?
I would not say I'm advocating, because I took a break. I took a hiatus. We did the last episode, or the most recent episode, published on December 31st. This spring, I had other work I had to get done. And as you can see behind me, maybe, there's an empty bookcase. I'm in an 80-year-old house that needed a lot of work, and it just had to get done. Whether I stay here or whether we sell it, this was, again, many people see this with older family members, deferred maintenance, or things that parents didn't even know were going on, leaks, problematic siding, things going on in the yard, trees that need to go. All the things many people take care of as a routine often fall off when somebody has cognitive loss. So that was sort of this period. I had other work I had to get done, and then this house had to be almost top to bottom, not remodeled, but simply, rehabilitated. So we just finished painting, and I can't quite show you, but there are no books on the shelves, there are no pictures on the walls. And we're just trying to kind of resettle, and having gone through most of the post-death activities you need to do to settle someone's estate, which is a lot of paperwork and a lot of time. That was kind of my period of this winter. And now this summer, I want to get going and get some more of these podcasts up, and also hear from people about what they want to hear, because I have plenty of things I wasn't able to get on the air after my dad died. Dealing with finances is one, preparing for death, which is, an action. It's the body is very active in order to die. I didn't know that, but I was learning kind of what ways I could be helpful and also take care of myself. There's an awful lot about how our institutions do or don't operate that maybe goes down a little like vegetables when you hear it on the radio. I used to edit loads of things at NPR, and I would tune out when it came to Medicaid or Medicare. That's for old people. I'm not that interested. Well, now I know how much it matters. But my job is to try to make that something that you want to lean in and listen to more. Tax law comes into play. Whether or not you have adequate institutions in the places you live. Lots of more rural places don't have adequate elder care facilities or enough people to do in-home caregiving, to hire outside. I've known plenty of colleagues who have family in more remote places or smaller towns where there simply isn't the care that I was able to access outside Washington, D.C. So hopefully I can get that up and running this summer. Please excuse my clumsiness here. And I'm not positive if we're still on, but I can
Kitty Isley.
You're still
see
with
that
us.
you're.
I launched a podcast about how I took care of my dad as he aged. Nothing could have prepared me for becoming a parent to my parent. Okay, Ernest Hemingway, here's your mug that says Ernest Hemingway on it.
Okay, good.
Be sure to drink your Ensure, and I'll make you a milkshake later.
Okay.
Becoming my dad's caregiver changed my life. Sometimes it was unspeakably hard. It also left me profoundly grateful. It made me reconsider what makes up a good life and how I could listen to my beloved dad so he could have a good death. I heard the same thing from so many people, that caregiving is one of the hardest things they've ever done, but one of the most meaningful, and that they wanted to hear more, learn more about this complex, deeply human experience. So now, welcome to season 2 of 24/7, a podcast about caregiving. Caregiving turns you inside out. You come out at the end different. That is certainly what happened for my first guest, another daughter who took care of her very famous father.
I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
That, of course, is our 40th president being sworn into office.
So help me God.
Now, I congratulate you, sir.
In 1994, 5 years after he finished his second term in office, former President Ronald Reagan was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. For the next decade, until his death, his daughter, Patty Davis, was intimately involved in his care.
I apologize, but I think I actually hit the button that made that play while I was trying to mute myself. So I know we have very little time left, and I apologize, but listeners get a taste of the podcast, and that wasn't even intentional. It just, I was trying to scoot the screen around. So I hope that's useful. And if anybody can make use of this, you can find my podcast at Texas Public Radio. You can also find it on the NPR One app. So NPR as a carrier is putting this up on its app, NPR One. But let me give it back to you, Tracy, because I know we're coming up short on time. And again, that was not intentional. I hope folks could hear it and that it was useful.
Oh, that was completely awesome. I cannot tell you how wonderful that was to give you that time.
Must have been Kismet. That's Dad talking.
Okay, so I apologize. I seem to be losing my line again. But I want to thank you so much for coming on the air today and sharing your experience with us, because through shared experience, we find out that we're not alone. And I do want to ask you one quick question. Have you ever gone to a death cafe?
I have not. I've heard about them. And I think I felt so enmeshed in death. But, I think it actually is a really interesting idea and really powerful. So it may be something I look into.
That would be very, very interesting, because I find it a kind of cathartic being able to talk to people about it, because unless you've experienced it, you don't know.
And it's not so scary. It's natural. It is scary, but it's as powerful as birth for the family going through it. And it has much more sadness, but I think there can be a great deal of spiritual peace that can come when you really understand and face what our time on the earth is limited.
Truly, truly. It is. And I also want to thank you very much again for joining us on our show. And I want to thank our audience for spending the time with us. And we will be back on July 18th. And our guest will be life coach B. Rhodes, who cared for her mother through her dementia, and how one session wearing a dementia VR goggle changed the way she cared for her mother. In the meantime, you can go over to our YouTube channel on US Global TV and Radio and look for the Dementia Home Care playlist and find the past episodes there. So see you next time.
Thank you so much, Tracy.
Thank you.